Welcome to the Japan Society. My name is Heidi Potter. I'm Chief Executive and organise events together with my colleague Kyoko Tachibana, who's also here this evening. And we're delighted to welcome for this lecture about Herbert Ponting, particularly in relation to Japan, by Anne Strathy, who is a writer and researcher on polar and on other subjects. She's recently published a book this year on Herbert Ponting, as Scott's Antarctic photographer, which is part of a loose trilogy of three books about members of Captain Scott's Terra Nova expedition. Talking to Anne before the lecture, she explained that although when Ponting was chosen to be the photographer for this expedition, many people in London and connected with the polar world thought that he'd come from absolutely nowhere. Of course, at the age of 40, Herbert Ponting had already had quite a long backstory, and a significant part of that backstory and a significant contribution to his development as a photographer was his time in Japan and other parts of East Asia. And so in researching her recent book, Anne visited Japan, visited the archive of the Japan Society to look into Ponting's background and his relationship with Japan and to follow in his footsteps there. And tonight she's going to explain and talk to us about Ponting, but maybe with a bit more of a focus on his Japan connections than his polar exploits. Thank you very much indeed for joining the Japan Society this evening.
Good evening. Like many people, I came across Ponting because of the books I'd written before on Antarctica. And when I started researching him, I saw that he had spent some time in Japan, probably a total of about 3 years out of a period of 6. But as I continued, I discovered that it was a very big influence in his life, disproportionate influence, I would say. So what I'm going to do is go through his life, but picking out the strands that relate to Japan in particular. And I hope you find it interesting. I apologize now for any mispronunciations I may make in Japanese names. And also, because this is a whole life biography, I'm very aware that there are people in the room who know more about photography, more about Japan than I do. So please excuse any oversights or anything in the talk from those departments. Right, I'm going to start. This is my third book, as I say. It was, Herbert Ponting had a much longer lifespan than my previous subject, so it will be a bit of a gallop through. There will be the chance for questions at the end, and I hope if you want to know more that you might read the book. We start in Antarctica. In 1911, 110 years ago, one of the things Scott did during the Antarctic winter, which is at the moment, was to organize a series of lectures. A lot of them were to do with science and things they were doing on the expedition, but Herbert Ponting's task was really more to entertain people. And as well as showing photos he had taken since arriving in Antarctica, he would show photographs from his travels. And when he came to make a photograph, and I say make advisedly, a photograph to represent these, the one he did with a little bit of 1911 photoshopping equivalent was this one, which shows one of his Japanese hand-colored photograph lantern slides. The Japan talk led to some discussion afterwards in that it turned out that Edward Wilson, chief scientist and expedition artist, was a great fan of Hokusai and Hiroshige and very much wanted to go to Japan. And he set about reading Ponting's Japanese memoir, In Lotus Land, Japan. Scott was also very interested and decided he might like to Japan. So Ponting's copies of Lotus Land, Japan were being lent out during most of the expedition. The culmination of the Antarctic winter, which had been in June, the darkest day of the year when there's no light above the horizon, and in fact it's only about August that it would be showing again, was the Antarctic Christmas. So this was Ponting's more usual role, which is to capture the expedition and the people on it. So now we'll transport back to Salisbury in 1870, where Ponting is born. Picture of the marketplace there. His father was a banker, his father in the top right. His father was not without ambition. He had started working in Salisbury as a 16-year-old bank clerk, but by the time Ponting was born, he was manager of a new branch bank in Salisbury. They then went on to another bank in Carlisle. Then he went on to head Preston Banking Company, at which point they lived in Southport, where he commissioned the rather splendid branch bank you see in the bottom there. Ponting had, through his life since as long as he could remember, be fascinated by stereo views, which were very fashionable then, made fashionable by Queen Victoria, the Great Exhibition. And he, was transported abroad by them. But before Ponting travelled, he had to work, and his father decided, as was the way in those days, that he should follow in father's footsteps. So Ponting went to work in Liverpool, which was commuting distance from Southport, the rather splendidly sturdy bank on the top left. Liverpool, despite being on the Atlantic side of Britain, he looked both west and east, best known for its ships to America. It had recently appointed, James Bowes had recently been appointed Japanese consul, the first British-born Japanese consul in Britain. And he had brought things back from Japan. He had a museum that was open in Strawberry Field of Beatles fame. He was also one of the co-founders, movers and shakers behind the Japan Society. While Ponting was in Liverpool, he was there for 4 years. There were 2 large photographic exhibitions, the Liverpool Amateur Photographic Association, and he joined the association. And in the second of the exhibitions, one of the things that was shown was photographs of Japan taken on a Kodak by Mrs. Liberty of Liberty Store in Regent Street. And she had gone with Alfred East and Charles Holmes, another Japan Society founder, to Japan, and she'd been photographing as they went. Mr. Liberty came and showed the photographs. In parallel with that, Liverpool every year had a big art exhibition. Previously it had been pre-Raphaelite shown, but the years that Ponting was there, and one of the curators was Arthur Melville, who was one of the Glasgow boys who were very interested in Japan and Japanism. One of his co-curators was Whistler, who had been supported by the Fine Arts Society, of which the director was Marcus Huish, another co-founder of the Japan Society. And one of the things that Whistler instigated that year was a Japanese room. The Mikado played regularly. Japanese merchants could be seen on the streets of Liverpool. So Ponting, in those 4 years, while he was at a bank that he wasn't really very interested in, he was being pretty saturated in Japanese culture. So he eventually agreed with his father that he wouldn't continue in his banking career, and his father purchased a fruit farm in California. And Ponting headed off for America in this Cunard ship that you can see, and he went to this farm. You can see that's a little painting of his farm in California, in Northern California, near Sacramento and about 100 miles from San Francisco. Ponting settled down there. He married the lady in the middle photograph in the top. She found the farm a bit remote. By the time they had a child, they went back to Britain for a visit. Ponting's father tried to persuade him to go back into banking. Ponting declined. They came back to America and they lived this time in Sacramento, just across the bay from San Francisco. And Ponting had obviously he didn't have his ranch then. He had also learned to do mining and he'd been a mine manager, but obviously there weren't mines in San Francisco. I think he missed his outdoors life. So he used to do climbing and so on quite a lot, but taking photographs. And while he was trying to decide what to do to support his family, he bumped into a photographer who asked him for the best viewpoints to make a photographic survey of the area. And he was so impressed with what Ponting told him, he asked to see his work. And he suggested that Ponting send some of his stereo views to stereo view companies, because there was a bit of it, while becoming a little bit old-fashioned in Britain, there was a big revival in America, a lot of competition between different companies. And Ponting began sending some in, and as you can see from the top right, the companion picture to the one of his wife became a commercial stereo view of him overlooking the bay at Sausalito. He was also taking family photographs. You can see the girl in the bottom left, and then that's the house they lived in. He then continued, his hobby was becoming pretty lucrative, and he expanded his sort of work. He would send in what he called novelty photographs. This is him diving in, and he's actually pulling a string, and that becomes quite important in the South Pole story. He's pulling a string to take the photograph of himself. The one below that is another one that became a commercial stereo view. That's one of his stereo views of Chinatown. Photographs of Chinatown were very popular. But the one that really made Ponting's name is this one of the mules. And he put that in for the first San Francisco Photographic Salon. And Arnold Genter, who a well-known photographer who was famous for his Chinatown photographs, described Ponting as a man who had an eye for photo, and said also that he had the gift of being there at the right time. So Ponting decided to pursue this possibility as a career, and he approached some of the stereo view companies, and one of them asked him to go to Asia. He also approached some magazines, and he had been placing articles in magazines, illustrated, and one of the magazines asked him to go east to cover the Philippines War, in which basically became the transfer of a lot of power in the Pacific from Spain to America. And so he went on his first visit, and he covered the ground in the Philippines fairly quickly. But what he really wanted to do was go to Japan, which had fascinated him for many years. So this is Ponting's first visit to Japan. I've put up that Hiroshige image because I think you can see how contemporary it looks, and it shares quite a lot of characteristics with composition for stereo views, which is to have something in the foreground like that lantern, and a long diagonal receding and interest in the middle ground, and that's what makes up the appeal of a stereo view and lets you see it in 3D. The next group of pictures are from Ponting's private Japanese album, which was auctioned a few years ago, sadly not to me. And that's him with some local friends and some of the geishas who became his regular models. Ponting was at great pains to point out in his book that geishas were not the same as courtesans. He found them very talented. Many of them spoke some English. He learned rudimentary Japan. That's them in the countryside, as you can see. He learned a lot from them: tea ceremonies, Japanese folk tales, theatre, poetry. He covered the ground. He started off in Yokohama, went to Tokyo, Kyoto, went outside to Nikko, where he stayed at the Kanaya Hotel, which when I was there, I found his signature in the hotel guest book. He went around Fuji and some of the resorts there, and he stayed at the Fujiya and Shoji hotels. At the Fujiya Hotel, he met Basil Hall Chamberlain, another luminary in the Japan Society, and W.B. Mason. He was very keen to meet them because he totally depended on the Murray's Guide to Japan, which they had revised and co-written the 1901 revised version. As I said, you'll see later on some of his photographs. Some of the previous geisha photographs available in stereos are very posed and unnatural looking. They don't look relaxed. I think when you see some of his photographs are definitely less touristy than other people's. One of the people he met, he also wanted to photograph craftsmen at work. And he was very taken by Namikawa, and that's Namikawa with Y rather than Namikawa S, who was a fellow perfectionist of Ponting. He made wonderful cloisonnés, and that's a picture of one of his cloisonné makers making a vase for the emperor. Ponting never held himself out to be a portrait photographer, but I think the photograph there, which shows Namikawa head and shoulders, does capture his calmness, and I say his perfectionism was such that in the same way as Ponting would sometimes smash glass plates, he would smash up pieces of cloisonné if they weren't up to his standards. And he photographed many other craftsmen and street scenes and everything. But after his first trip came to an end, he went back to America to return the photographs for the company to choose which ones they wanted. He went in for more competitions. The ones on the left are competition winning ones. With the telephoto, he's becoming quite adept with the telephoto, and that becomes important later. He also had his mules photograph was at the St. Louis World Fair, as in Meet Me in St. Louis, and that's the Kodak Pavilion where it was hung 6 foot by 4 foot, which again gives an example of the quality of lenses and film plates he was using, that they could blow it up to that size. He returns to Japan, and this time he didn't manage the first time. He was outside the Fuji climbing season, but this time he does get to climb Fuji. He explores more first. He goes around the inland sea. He goes back to Nikko and Hakone. He goes in a third trip, he goes to Hokkaido. But he climbed Fuji, and this is one of his self-portraits. He's probably pulling the string again. But as you can see, perhaps foreshadowing him photographing snow. Also, that's him at one of the volcanoes which exploded. In Lotusland, there's a dramatic description of that. He's willing to risk most things for a photograph. Before he left his second trip, it became very obvious that the Russo-Japanese war was going to break out, which was basically over control of Manchuria and Korea. And he knew that it would be quite difficult to get to the front, and there was beginning to be military restrictions even in the main cities, particularly around the coast. So he made a lightning tour of where he thought were going to be the main places of conflict: Port Arthur, the Russian enclave in Japan, and so on. And he went to Mukden, And he took these photos, went back to California to see his family, and then waited to see what would happen next. The Stereoview company chose more photographs, but within another 6 months, he was back again, this time with another different magazine, Harper's Weekly, with another Stereoview company who had liked his Stereoview and wanted to upgrade their Japan Stereoview set. And this time he did cover the Russo-Japanese War. It took a long time to get permission to go to the front. So he went down to Hiroshima, where they had a very big military hospital. You can see in that top photograph. He also photographed the war leaders. And sometimes he had to do it in Tokyo when they came back to report, because even people like Jack London, the adventure story writer, he couldn't get to the front, and he rather left in disgust because he was so fed up of being imprisoned and told he couldn't go anywhere near the front. One of the things he did that was quite unusual, he very often photographed the war leaders with their children, and these were very popular with magazines. So eventually he did get to the front, but then he had to decide what to do next. The war came to an end. There was a peace treaty. When he went back to Tokyo, he published a book of 25 views of Fuji. And these sets of photographs are by way of tribute to Hokusai and Hiroshige with their 100 views of Fuji. And it's Fuji from all different angles in all different ways, sometimes in the distance and so on. He did the books in conjunction with Keogawa, who was from a samurai family, but had spent a lot of time in America learning both printing and photographic. He was a founder member of the Japan Society, of the Japanese Photographic Society, not Japan Society. And Fuji-san was dedicated to Basil Hall Chamberlain and A.E. Mason. It was very popular with tourists and expats, people living in Japan. And I put including Charles V. Sale ? Because when I bought that copy of Japanese Studies, which was his follow-up book, out fell a little business card of Charles V. Sale. And as you'll see, he later went on to be the chair of the Japan Society and also head of Hudson's Bay Company. Kelly and Walsh were the distributors of both books, and they suggested that Ponting perhaps write a longer Japanese memoir. But before that, two things he did. One was to ask Basil Hall Chamberlain to nominate him as a member of the Royal Geographical Society, which he did. And so Ponting, while he was waiting to hear about that, went on another trip. He went to India. And on his way, he was originally going to go to China. And on his way there, he met a man called Cecil Mears, who was a great traveller, much more travelled than Ponting from a very early age. And Mears spoke Hindu and Hindi, and he suggested that rather than going straight to China, that they divert, and I've used the old names here, via Ceylon, Burma, and India. So Ponting took more stereoviews. As you can see, he rode in an elephant. The photo below that of Ponting taking photos of alligators is actually taken by Mears. They went to the, sorry, I've gone completely blank on the place. Anyway, the hill station, Simla, where they took photographs of the Himalayas. And that is a dancer. I put that photo in because the one of the dancer, because it shows the way that magazines used Ponting's photographs. They would color heighten them. And I mentioned it in passing, one of the magazines that Ponting's war photographs had been in also featured photographs from Captain Scott's Discovery Expedition. And as it happened, Mears, after he was planning to go to the China-Tibet border, and he suggested that if Ponting was thinking of going back to London rather than San Francisco, Ponting and his family are a whole different story. But if he was going to go to London, he would enjoy reading Scott's discovery reports. So Ponting decided he would do that. And he, as I say, his wife was from a well-established San Francisco family. I think they just weren't that well suited, had perhaps married quite in haste. The engagement notice appeared about 2 weeks before the wedding notice. So I think, as they say, it just didn't work out. And Ponting had not seen his parents probably since 1901. So he decides to go back to London, reading Scott's discovery report as he was. And in London, where the Mikado was regularly playing at D'Oyly Cart and other theatres, and Japanism is still very popular, his photographs are very popular. I think you can see from the two on the left in particular how Ponting's photos of geishas are very different. The one in the middle, which a magazine has put a surrounding, is more typical. But I think what I called these in the book are sort of respectful but intimate photographs, and he was much acclaimed for them. He had an exhibition at the British Journal of Photography galleries. They featured in articles. He would get full-page photographs in Illustrated London News. But when he exhibited some of his photo in the Alpine Club of Fuji and some of the American mountains he had photographed and climbed and photographed, somebody said in a review that they weren't quite sure whether Fuji and the Rockies, the Sierra Nevada, counted as Alps. So Ponting was stung into action and he went to Europe. And I think you can immediately see Matterhorn, like Fuji, is a very iconic mountain. Similarly, it is surrounded by 5 lakes. And if you ever look at Fuji-san or a lot of Ponting's photographs, you'll see the same thing of somebody in the foreground or a tree or something in the foreground, and then the mountain reflected in the lake, similar. But he takes a lot of photographs of the Matterhorn. So all is going well. He starts writing his Japanese memoir, and then Mears, who has had quite a torrid time in the China-Tibet borders, somebody he was traveling with got killed. He comes back to London, and I think Mears has probably had enough of the China-Tibet border for a while. And he decides he's going to go to the RGS and see if he can sign up on a polar expedition. So that's exactly what he does. And then he suggests that Ponting and Scott meet. So Ponting, who is not scared of hard work, he agrees to join the expedition, but he's still finishing his Japanese memoir. He is going to be exhibiting in the Japan-British exhibition about the time the expedition is leaving. His memoir has got about 100 photographs in it. That's got to be dealt with. So Ponting has got about 9 months of extreme multitasking. He's buying the photographic kit. He's learning to make movies. Top left, he's ordering all the supplies. That's him in the ship's hold with Borough Welcome, developing fluid. His memoir, after much toing and froing with Macmillan and Co. about the colour of the wisteria in that particular photograph, is finally published the day the Terra Nova leaves London. He's giving talks with Scott about the expedition. he also, one thing he didn't have time for is the London Photographic Salon at the Fine Arts Society. And that was only the first photographic exhibition at the Fine Arts Society run by Marcus Huish, who had exhibited Whistler's work and had also by this time exhibited Japanese prints. So in June 1910, the ship leaves. Ponting is going to catch a steamer part of the way, but he is just too busy. He keeps on putting it off. Scott leaves by steamer and catches up with the ship. Ponting realizes he's never going to catch up with the ship in South Africa, gets a fast steamer, catches up with it in New Zealand. They get to in Australia. They then get to New Zealand. He arrives just on shore, just as the ship comes in. They have a month in New Zealand getting the ship ready, and then they're on the way south to Antarctica. So we've now got Ponting with a huge amount of equipment and no backup. There's everything he's got to do for himself. He takes some very striking photos because they cross into the Ross Sea at the very beginning of January 1911. To avoid being frozen in, the ship has got to leave by March. So Ponting has got to take some really striking photographs and make movies to go back with the ship so that they can be published in newspapers and magazines and publicize the expedition, which still needs money. And that's him leaning over the side of the ship, taking the ship cutting through the ice. He gets very lucky because on his first day on the ice, he manages to take the photo on the right, which was then and still remains one of the iconic photographs of the expedition, through an ice grotto with the ship in the background. He feels a lot of pressure. He's the first professional photographer to Antarctica. He's working desperately against time. If we think the clocks have turned now, in Antarctica, you're losing half an hour a day. The light is changing very quickly. By April, the sun will have been going below the horizon. It won't come back till March. So February, March, Ponting is racing around taking photographs. And his new iconic mountain is Mount Erebus, which, like Fuji, is a dormant volcano. And you can just see it in the top photograph on the left. That's the group leaving for the depot laying journey. They've got to lay depots to go to the South Pole. I've just put this range of photographs to show you the range of work Ponting was doing. He's taking photographs of the men at work, and that at the bottom, the left-hand side is Edward Wilson making a photograph of a celestial phenomenon like the one on the left. Ponting, much to his frustration, never managed to take photographs of them, never managed to capture the aurora during the winter. The photograph going along the top now is Cecil Mears with Captain Oates boiling up food for the dogs. Cecil Mears on the right of that too, with the coming off the barrier. I think you agree it's quite a haunting photograph. Ponting was doing his lectures below that. The photograph on the top right is Captain Scott, who, and that's him, may not be able to make it out, but that's him with a tripod, because Ponting is teaching him to take photographs, because Ponting's equipment is so heavy that he won't be going to the pole. And he has to get back anyway with his films to get them processed so they're shown in theatres. He's also capturing the wildlife. So that's a range of his work. He has got many customers, really. He's doing everything, as I say. That's his heavy sledge, sometimes almost falls through the ice. He's got telephoto lenses, top right. He's quite a handyman after his time in America. He builds himself a laboratory. He had a very small studio in Japan, in Tokyo. So he's used to working in cramped conditions. Excuse me. And that's him, that's his little studio. He had to keep fit, standing on his head, and that's him developing He's also taking photographs for the companies that supported the expedition to use as advertisements. That's one for Burroughs Wellcome, of him, the bottom left, him using their developing fluid. I've put up, Japan is never far away. I think the two photographs on the center and on the left, when I saw them, I blinked because they are compositionally very similar. And he also took the same photographs, portrait style. And as you can see, the waterfall, where the waterfall is on the Fuji photograph, the ice shelf is almost in exactly the same position. I think he had a very strong visual memory for what he had taken and what had worked. Obviously, there's no trees in Antarctica, so you couldn't completely create the effect, but I think the photos were always there. The other thing that, if you remember the volcano photograph, he's always striving for a sense of scale, which is difficult to get in Antarctica. So he has people posing beside it. He's got many clients, both internal and external. The scientists want him to do their scientific photos, but he's also got to do ones for magazines. He's using many forms, stereo views, which are sadly lost, we think, plates, roll film, and he's taking ones for magazines, expedition reports, memoirs. Sometimes they can only use roll film because if he's traveling, plates get broken and damaged. It's not been an easy life. But Ponting, as some of you will know, quite like to discuss describing himself as a camera artist. And I think you'll see there that these photographs, are very modern looking, really, and would have been the kind of thing that if things had been different after the expedition, he might well have submitted to salons and so on. He also had to learn flash photography. He'd done a little bit in Japan, but to try and light up that huge iceberg, he ended up enlisting people. People did help him out, but they all had their own jobs to do. So he was left mainly working on his own. He never got to climb Fuji. I think he would have liked to, but that wasn't feasible. At the bottom in the middle is an autochrome plate, and he wasn't pleased with them at all. So there were times where Edward Wilson's beautiful drawings and watercolors won out. For his sunsets are much better. And Ponting put it down to, by the time he got there, they were out of date. And the problem was they'd also passed through the tropics twice and the equator. So even in the hold of the ship, they were getting very hot. I've put the photo on the right there. It's the version I put there is from a magazine. It took me a very long time to find a published version of it. But Ponting took that photo when he was out on his own. And to me, that's probably got the timelessness of a Hiroshige Hokusai painting. It's also got the very high horizon and the sort of less is more. It's his sledge tracks crossing with the tracks of an Adelie penguin. And again, I think it's a photo he would have exhibited if things had been different after the expedition. So what did happen next? Ponting left the expedition in April 1912. Scott and his party were not back from the South Pole. The last thing they knew was that they had been seen leaving on the 4th of January, setting out for the pole, 5 of them. So Ponting goes back to London, but on the way back in New Zealand, they learn that Amundsen did get to the pole. They knew he was there. There was also a Japanese expedition, which is worth finding out more about if people are interested. Unfortunately, Ponting didn't meet them either on the way down or up. I think he would very much have liked to. They weren't really trying for the pole, but Amundsen did get there. So before, when Ponting got back to London, people already knew about Amundsen. Took slightly the wind out the sails, but as that poster will show, or program will show, his films were shown They're processed by Gaumont and edited by Gaumont. They were shown as part of theatre bills, in that case at the London Coliseum with Sarah Bernhardt. And then Ponting carries on working, getting photographs ready for the expedition reports, slightly fretting under the constraints for having been very independent in Antarctica. And he and Mears are planning another expedition to India photographing, but he's got too much expedition work. So he goes on holiday for Christmas 1912. He goes to Switzerland. And when he's in Switzerland, he gets a telegram saying that Scott and the other 4 members of the South Pole Party have died. He rushes back to London, and there is a memorial service at St. Paul's. Similar to the Titanic, not that long ago, but the King attends because he was a fellow HMS Britannia alumnus like Scott. It changes everything for Ponting. His photographs are effectively expedition and public property, very tightly controlled. There are medal ceremonies. You can see both, those are Ponting's medals on the black background, the top ones. The one on the right is a medal that Ponting got in 1907 from the Emperor of Japan for his services in the Russo-Japanese War, for his reporting. And those are the RGS and King's polar medals with them. Teddy Evans, who was the naval number 2 in the expedition, the scientific number 2 was, Wilson had obviously died, so Teddy Evans is effectively Scott's deputy to all intents and purposes, and he uses Ponting's pictures to give lectures. Ponting had agreed with Scott that once Scott had done a few lectures, he would do it. But so that doesn't work out for him. But eventually, once the expedition reports are out, they arrange for an exhibition of photographs at the Fine Arts Society. And Marcus Huish, which makes me wonder whether Ponting knew him from before, he actually came out of retirement. He had retired by then, and he wrote the introduction to the catalogue and speaks very warmly of Ponting. So there is a possibility they had known each other before. There's also exhibitions of Edward Wilson's watercolours. I've put that one on the top right because that is the same iceberg as Ponting took the flash photographs of. It gives you an idea of the differences. The exhibitions tour around Britain and overseas. And finally, in 1914, Ponting is allowed to give his own lectures, and he hires the Philharmonic Hall, prints up a programme. That's Ponting in his dapper suit and hat. He issues postcards. He issues, these are tiny little penguin cards, and there's one for France there. He's got somebody lecturing in France. There are other people lecturing in America. It's a very big thing, and that carries on for about 6 months or so, pretty much unabated. But he then lends his photographs of Edward Wilson to Kathleen Scott. And if you look at the top 2 photographs, that's a picture of Edward Wilson, and you'll see the statue of Edward Wilson in Cheltenham, where I live. And he's wearing exactly the same outfit. Apparently, Astley Cherry Garrard also modelled for Kathleen Scott, wearing similar clothes. The other interesting photo I want to show you at the bottom, underneath Edward Wilson, is one of the men, Wilson and Birdie Bowers, and not Oates, but Teddy Evans, eating in the hut. Eating in a tent. That was actually done before they left, but that was very popular. And Cecil Mears Ponting was busy in London lecturing, took his films down to Cheltenham, and there was great cheering whenever Wilson appeared on the screen. But Wilson's statue was put up in July 1914. But by that time, the Archduke Ferdinand had been shot in Sarajevo, and by Christmas, the photograph below Edward Wilson, Cecil Mears was at the front at Ypres, and we enter the war. Ponting applies to the Foreign Office to see if he can become a war photographer again. They said he's over 40, so he's above the age for volunteering, doesn't get to go, carries on lecturing. In the middle of the war, one or two of their comrades die, but the one that's probably best known is Harry Pennell, who was acting captain of the Terra Nova for some time, very popular member of the expedition. He loses his life in the Battle of Jutland, and that's the Queen Mary, the ship he was on after it was blown up. Meanwhile, Shackleton is trying to cross Antarctica, an endurance expedition, and his photographer, Frank Hurley, after they're released from the ice in 1916, comes to see Ponting, comes to his lectures, and that's them holding Ponko, the toy mascot that Ponting has for marketing to children. And he is very impressed by Ponting's photographs, as is a young man, John Knoll, who, young army officer who had been to Tibet to try and find a way to Everest, because people were, now both poles had been, they thought the North Pole had been conquered. Again, that's another story. But the South Pole had gone, people were thinking of climbing Everest. Ponting finally got to do some war service. He went to Spitsbergen on a couple of expeditions, but much to his frustration, he's frustrated during quite a bit of the war, as you can imagine. He was living in central London, which was quite heavily bombed, but he was fine. He caught the flu a few times. He had quite a weak chest. But when he goes to Spitsbergen in 18 and 19, when they come back a few months later, the Versailles Peace Treaty hands it over to Norway. So Britain doesn't get Spitsbergen. Moving on from that period, 1920, Ponting finally writes his memoir of Antarctica called The Great White South. He includes an introduction by Kathleen Scott, who praises him very highly. Also, the King's praise for him and hope that young men, schoolboys will read about the adventures. During the war, Ponting had sent his films to the south, to the battlefields, where particularly the example of Captain Oates sacrificing his life to save his comrades did make quite an impact, and the King was very struck by that. So The Great White South was an immediate success, went into second, third editions printed every year, every 6 months sometimes, always sold very well at Christmas. On the back of that, Ponting did a revised version of In Lotus Land, Japan. You saw the red covered version before. If you ever buy a second-hand one, and I would recommend it, it's worth it for the photographs. This one has got a slightly different introduction, but it's equally interesting, and a lot of Ponting anecdotes. It's a good read. Slightly old-fashioned, obviously, from 1910, but but as you can see, he keeps the geisha and it was popular in America as well. Looking for other ways of showing his photographs and films. So when Ponting was lecturing, it was what was called a cinema lecture, which is a combination of still photographs and moving clips from his films. He sets about making a full-length film. So instead of somebody lecturing, there will be what they call intertitles. And they have, in 1924, that comes out. It was originally going to be called The Great White South after the book, but it was then changed at the last minute to The Great White Silence. And the photograph at the top left is the premiere, where they had a lot of sea cadets who came to welcome guests. Around that time, Ponting also goes to the Japan Society, joining an artist friend of his who has been to Japan. And so that's when he visits the Japan Society. So he's still, he's involved with Japan still, but more really Antarctica. And Hurley also releases films. And by this time, the Everest expeditions are coming back. And John Knoll, who used the same kind of cameras as Ponting and consulted with both Ponting and the camera maker, he comes back and there are Everest films. So Ponting's very much the leader in that. So what's he going to do next? He's got 2 inventions on the go. He gets a medal from P.H. Emerson, somebody who would call on the artistic side of the photography spectrum. And he meets Glai Carodas, who is a friend, or who is the niece of friends of Arthur Newman, who is the camera maker who makes cameras for Hurley and Knoll and Ponting. So the photo below that is Ponting in his Buick. So he's a bit of a man about town. Glai is, her full name's Gladys, is considerably younger than him. She's a singer. She's quite shy. I would say she probably suffers from stage fright. So her career doesn't go quite as far as Ponting would have liked. But he was so smitten with her that they did want to get married, but he was still married to his American wife. He hadn't seen his family. They had come over around the time he was going to leave for Antarctica, but he didn't meet up with them. So he hadn't seen them since about 1906, about almost 20 years by this time, which was a source of great sadness to him, but it was sort of an irretrievable situation, I think. Glai had a few stage successes, but as I say, she did seem to suffer from stage fright. Around this time, Ponting is still writing articles. His book is very popular, and but we're now in the middle of the Depression and the Wall Street crash. And Ponting, like everybody, finds it difficult to make money. And sort of movement starts, various journalists and so on, to try and get Ponting's films purchased from him for the nation. And that does happen. Charles V. Sale of the Hudson's Bay Company, by then chair of the Japan Society, does contribute to funds. That's one of the other donors on the right. And that on the left is, and then the Duke of York, who became King George VI. And he was very keen on Ponting's films and showed them to scouts groups and things like that. The 2 photos on the right are Ponting's inventions, the kinetome, which was a compact movie projector. Unfortunately, Ponting has prolonged correspondence with George Eastman of Eastman Kodak around this time, who he's quite keen to collaborate with on his inventions, not surprisingly. And but Eastman Kodak beats him to bringing out a projector and also brings out a matching camera, which Ponting hasn't got. So he has spent a lot of money on patents, but doesn't make any money. Also, the other one is called a distortograph. And he saw it's made by using lenses and making sort of cartoon types from photographs, which can be made into small movies. That's Malcolm Campbell, the racing driver who Ponting knew. He was a member of the RAC club, as was Malcolm Campbell. So Ponting by this time has exhausted himself with his latest version of his film, which was called 90 Degrees South. He's borrowed money to do it. It costs more than he expected. He put music on it with the BBC. He is making BBC broadcasts, not doing any lecturing now, but he gradually becomes iller. He's always had chest problems. He has heart problems. He is running out of money. He never owns a property. He always rents in London, and his inventions are unsold. And he becomes very ill. the Scott Polar Institute opens, and on the day of that opening, he does manage to make a broadcast, not himself. He's made quite a lot himself, both about Japan and about Antarctica, including I think one of his last ones is firewalking in Japan, and he's written articles about it. So he keeps both strands. There is a big Royal Photographic Society expedition, and they do show as many of Ponting's other photos as they do Antarctica. He's probably one of the single biggest exhibitors in that. It's photography and travel. And people always comment on the Japanese memorabilia. He has bought a small cloisonné vase from Namikawa. He's got his personal Japanese album that he shows people. He quite late in life sent a first edition of In Lotus Land, Japan to somebody, in fact, to the wife of the man who is handing over the films there in the previous slide. He does have a surprising success with his distortograph film, in that it's used for special effects in the drug scene in Emil and the Detectives, when Emil is hallucinating. And although some of the obituary by Cherry Garrard was quite short and to the point, but what struck me when I saw obituaries in the papers was he was very much loved in the film world and the Fleet Street world. And he was buried in Golders Green. When he died, he didn't have enough money to meet his doctor's bills, so an exhibition was organized of his pictures in his flat, and that's the catalogue from it. And we discovered from his personal Japanese album that a certain young man called Paul Popper bought some framed Japanese prints from it. And I'll tell you what happened about that in a minute, in the next slide. Also, people from the Japanese embassy came, and there was a certificate that went with Ponting's Japanese medal, and somebody comments in the papers that they suddenly looked and they were all standing in front of it bowing. So they obviously thought Ponting was, they realized that Ponting was very honored in Japan. A lot of people come. Captain Oates's sister comes, and people buy photographs. There is a lot of memorabilia in Ponting's flat. That's some of it on the right, which is now in the Royal Collection. So Ponting didn't leave very much money, but I think you can see he did leave a good few other legacies. His 2 films have been shown regularly and have been remastered by the EFI, as has Emil and the Detectives. That's the German and the English version. Regularly in exhibitions, both in galleries all over the world, really. The Heart of the Great Alone was one that was his photos and Hurley's, and that toured England, Scotland, Australia, New Zealand, where it closed just before the Christchurch earthquake. You see people buy prints of his photographs. That's one of his photographs of which he was most proud. It took him 14 attempts to get the lake still, no cloud on Fuji, and the Kai grass not waving. You can still find copies of his books. I'd recommend, if you see one, snap it up. They're very beautiful, printed in the Japanese style. In Lotus Land, you can still see copies. The Great White South, you can either get secondhand or it is available, I think it's called With Scott to the Pole or something, in a modern version. And one I was very pleased to see when I was in Japan, this little book on the right, which is tiny compared to the others. And it's a Japanese version that was published in 2011. So that's really what I'd like to tell you about Ponting. But I think the story goes on. You'll have your own idea of Ponting. I hope this has given you a rounded impression of him, including the influence Japan had in him and his activities there. I hope my book does that. there is a new plaque going up to him. There's going to be another exhibition. His work always crops up in auction. His photographs are my illustrations for my previous books, both on the cover and inside. And the photograph in the middle is Ponting's great-grandson and his grandson. And by coincidence, the great-grandson's daughter was married to a Japanese gentleman, which I didn't know. And I sent them a Ponko, and they've also, for the first time since Ponting, have used the name Herbert for a new baby that's arrived in the family. So different legacies. So that's it. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much indeed. That was I'm exhausted just listening to you going through this life. I think we all need to read the book. We have a review of the book on our website if anyone's interested in reading a bit about it. And also tied to that, the reviewer Susan Meehan has also reviewed In Lotus Land, so you can read up about that book as well if you're interested. So if you go to the Japan Society website, you can find both of those. We have a few questions already in the chat, but before we go to the questions, Anne, can you talk a little bit about your visits to Japan and how you tried to find Ponting in Japan?
Yes, I'd already been to Antarctica when I wrote, in preparation for writing my first book. So I did rather wish I'd photographed inside Ponting's studio, but I didn't know I was going to be writing. I didn't feel that was a bit extravagant to go back to Antarctica again just to do that. So I decided to go to Japan, to California, and to Spitsbergen. And I managed to find a locally based tour company that did ancient roads of Japan. So it was covering the places that would all have been there, and we virtually went to all the places. They were also very flexible in that I explained what I was wanting to do, and they were very flexible in that they didn't mind if I went off on my own as long as I fetched up back at the hotel that evening. And I managed to go to Namikawa Cloisonné Museum. And I think one of the people who, oh yes, I can see Greg Irvin very kindly. I didn't manage to see the visitors book, but I did see their album of photographs, and Ponting's photographs are all over their walls, all the ones he took of them. And also I found a pack of postcards in Kyoto. Greg Irvin kindly looked when he went back to Japan, and he went to Namikawa Studio, and he found Ponting's name in the visitors book. I found his name in 2 hotel registers. People found them in their museums and their old hotel registers. And one of them was particularly interesting because it told me how much he was uncertain about his marriage, because in the book it says name, nationality, place of residence, and he just leaves it blank. And clearly the desk clerk has said, you need to put something. And he's obviously said, well, put Tokyo, because it's in a completely different handwriting, Tokyo. So you can tell that he's undecided whether to go back to America or London. Walk the Pilgrim Way. It was, and we went to Hiroshima. So I got the feel for what Hiroshima was like, and so on. And it was, I could see, and I went to Nikko as well when I was shown the hotel that he stayed in. And I visited 2 hotels he stayed in, which are pretty much the same. So it was a very good, and the tour company, Dragonfly Tours Japan, were very helpful in letting me make it semi-independent. And we traveled by bullet train rather than coach. So we had more of a feeling, because he traveled by train himself, because the railways were very well developed. So I did feel I was slightly channeling Ponting, which was good.
Did you say that you found him together with Basil Hall Chamberlain in Japan as well?
That was in the hotel. He went back there, and I did find his signature around just before the time that I found the RGS found his application form. And from the date, that was when Ponting went to get Basil Hall Chamberlain to sign it. And, so things just gradually, it helped you feel it, because there are no diaries, no Antarctic diary, nothing. The paper all gone. So you're working from one side. The only place where there was double correspondence was the Eastman Museum, because George Eastman was so important, his secretary kept copies of the letters. That's the only place.
Both way. Interesting. Thank you, Anne. Greg Irvin has asked, do you know what's happened to the Namikawa cloisonné vase that Ponting had?
No, I don't. I think it probably gets scooped up. I think a lot of people probably dealing his executor, somebody became his executor who I don't think knew very much about what Ponting did, and a lot of stuff just got scooped up. I know it was small, but he did say it was very expensive. He did. I said I would finish the story about the sale and Paul Popper. Paul Popper bought several Japan prints, as we know, because they sometimes come up, but they did use Ponting's album when they were having the sale, marking up who got them. It says PP. But Paul Popper then went back and bought all the remaining photographs and negatives and plates. And that's why they're on Getty, because Paul Popper's company is still going. And that's why the images are on Getty. But there are many other copies and things, because that's the nature of photographs in other places. But that sale was, you just don't know where some of the stuff has gone. I've no idea what happened to his stereo views of Antarctica. He says when he got back, he said he had them. There's no sign of them ever being published or anything.
Right. Are there opportunities to see his film from?
Yes, you can see it online from the BFI website. It's not expensive to watch. Both versions. The other film I probably should have mentioned is Scott of the Antarctic, because once you've read the books and seen the photographs, you'll recognise that a lot of the scenes from that are tableaus that start from a Ponting still, particularly the Christmas dinner. It's all they start with the Ponting photographs and then they all start talking.
Oh, interesting.
So there's a lot of legacies from him.
Somebody asked where you managed to track down all the different photographs, because you're saying the images were wonderful.
Well, because of the vagaries of copyright, I, to be honest, could not afford to pay Getty £100 a photograph or more to use it in the book. And I bought old copies of the books and had them professionally scanned, because he's had copyright. I contacted the publishers and got their okay to do that.
So that includes all the family photographs from the States?
No, the family photographs I bought in an auction, and they are original stereo views. They passed through several hands. I have no idea. The vendor was quite coy about how they came across them. No, those ones of the family are a particular set, together with some little bits of photographic equipment that might be that might have been owned by Ponting.
I think
so. No, I did get them in different places, and I bought one or two. The one of the Matterhorn was one I came across in an auction, and it was in a bundle, and I turned it over, and there's Ponting's handwriting. So I stuck my hand up for that one. And I've got my own copies of Fuji-san and Japanese Studies.
Yeah.
Quite a lot of original magazines as well. You can get them on the web.
Well, I think we've kind of run out of time. Thank you so much, Anne. There's lots of comments in the chat. People said how much they've enjoyed the talk. So thank you so much. It's been brilliant to have you with us. Thank you indeed for sharing his life with us.
Yes, thank you to everybody for coming.
Right, goodbye.
Bye-bye.